Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the first ever episode of Robert's Roulette, your favorite variety program with zero shame in deviating from any structure, pace, or sense. Welcome to our first ever episode. And so it begins. What is this show going to be about? That seems to be the million-dollar question posing. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for stopping by. Hope you have a good time. Welcome to the first ever episode of Robert's Roulette, your favorite variety program with zero shame in. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Thank you for stopping by. Hope you have a good time. My name is Robert, and welcome to the first ever episode of Robert's Roulette, your favorite variety program with zero shame from deviating from any pace, structure, or sense. And so it begins. Today we're going to stop by introducing myself. Hello. Hope you're having a good night. My name is Robert, host, creator, producer, editor, pretty much everything behind Robert's Roulette. What is this show going to be about? Absolutely nothing, but at the same time, many things on my mind will be shared tonight. For instance, tonight we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting topics that I have. You know, a lot has happened in the past week, movie-wise, personal life stuff, of course. And I'd like to begin, stressing and, well, not stressing. Well, I'm always stressing, you know what I mean? But I got to be honest, I am a little bit nervous. It's not my first time creating content on YouTube. I've been doing it for pretty much 2025, pretty much 12 years now. It's more so a new hill to have to, conquer. I'm not really that great improvising on the spot. I usually operate better when I have a script to accompany with, to have a bit of structure. And also, as you might have noticed already, my English is getting a little bit rusty, if I do say so myself. I live in Mexico, so that's always good to hear about. And luckily, because I'm currently working at a call center, it does allow me to practice, my English dialect. So that way I can still, have a little bit of my accent there and also, not to completely forget the language. You know what I mean? Is this my first time being on YouTube? Absolutely not. How do I get started? Fairly simple, really. It all started many, many years ago, around 2006, actually. Around 2006, where my father had a very close relationship with a man, a friend. At least that's what he says. Nah, I'm just kidding. He was basically my uncle, but he was more so a really, really close friend of the family. Until one day he convinced, I'm not quite sure. No, he didn't convince him. Me and my brother always wanted a dog when we were like 5 or 4 years old. So then my so-called uncle, but in reality he was just a really close friend of the family, he brought home a Chihuahua. And I fell in love with this Chihuahua. He looked like a little tiny little gremlin. I thought he was the cutest thing in the world. He died. No, he didn't. We lost him a few years ago, but yeah, it's a pretty big feat for a Chihuahua to live with you for over, Jesus Christ. Well, we lost him like a little over 2.5 years ago, 2023-ish, 2022. I don't really remember. It's been a minute. And ever since 2006, like around 16, 17, I'm terrible with math, as you might have noticed. But we had a Chihuahua. His name was Max. And I loved him. He was really cute. He had a lot of personality. He was kind of like a grumpy little dog. However, the next day of me getting this Chihuahua, I was, I believe, given the time frame, the timeline, I'm fairly certain. Yeah, I was pretty much in middle school. No, not middle school. I was pretty much in preschool, basically. And the teacher had basically bestowed upon us an activity to do as a group. What was this activity? Fairly simple. We had to basically make a cartoon. It was a free-for-all with the pencils, Crayolas, anything that a small underage student could have at the time, we had in our hands. We basically had to make, an illustrated book with, very minimalistic dialogue and text. And so, me feeling that high about getting a Chihuahua in my home, I was like, you know what? I'm going to start writing a story about my little dog, Max. So, I started my very own first IP at the rightful age of 5 or 6, I don't really remember, called Max the Dog. It was pretty much, I had a rule that I had, because at the time I was like, oh my God, I'm going to write my own book. It was like a big deal at the time, even though, it was probably just going to end up in the recycling bin at the end of the class. But I kept it. I was really proud of that little, It was weird. I was more excited about drawing the cover than actually writing, because it wasn't even a comic. It was just a 3-page book with like insanely like 17-inch, sentence bars that we had to write across the line, from left to right. And it was an incredibly, I don't even remember what the story was. All I remember was, coloring in with my brown crayon, my very rudimentary it was a terrible design, but it was Max, and I made it, and I was proud of it. Max the dog. I can still remember the little logo. I remember I was thinking about it, for a solid 2 minutes, like, what is this logo going to be? Because I demanded consistency with my own comics when I was a young lad. So I was like, well, if this is going to be an ongoing series, I would like for it to have its own little logo, for merchandising or, franchise purposes. I'll get to that in a minute. But it was Max the dog, Max in large, bold red text, and the dog in large, thick blue text. Max the dog. And right under it was, a little illustration of Max walking across, a sidewalk, I believe it was. And history was made. Every single day, I would squeeze in a couple of minutes of my own free time in preschool, and I would love, I'm not just talking about writing or drawing, Max the dog books. I remember feeling an immense amount of gratification sharing it with my teacher at the time. Back when I lived in, because, fun fact, I was born here in Mexico, but I was raised primarily in the States, from ages 2 to like around 10 or 11 in Virginia County State. I remember I used to attend, Fairfax County Riverside Public School. And I had a teacher at the time who, it wasn't so much, encouragement, but she would, hear me out in a lot of my excitement and, whimsy of, the random stuff that I would do during class. Like, for instance, with these Max the Dog books. I remember, because I didn't really have friends at the time. And sure, my mom and my dad and my brother were there, of course, but I remember, she was like the first person to read, one of my books. And those books really were the beginning, because I can't really remember anything before that in terms of me being in tuned in my creative instincts, I should say. And she was the first one to really, give me that little dice of dopamine in my brain that really carried on for many days, weeks, months, and years. Because from ages 6 all the way to age 11 or 12, or I think even 13, I continued that hobby. I created far beyond more sequels than I possibly could have imagined. Call me Disney. I basically milked that dog. Max the Dog 2, 3, 4. I remember it was so effing stupid. I would get so excited about making those damn covers than actually writing or giving the stories any substance. I just loved the idea of just drawing a gigantic 2 or a 3 right next to the Max the Dog logo, because it felt like such a big deal. Oh my God, a sequel. And I would just write in the craziest, asinine thing you could possibly imagine for this Max character to go through. And in my eyes, it was like, oh my God, I'm, move over, Nolan, move over, Del Toro, whatever. It's like, no, I'm writing the real good stuff. because it was Max the Dog 7, Attack of the Kidnapper, and blah, blah, blah. I started introducing characters, reoccurring characters. There was this main villain. I just generically called him the Kidnapper. And he would kidnap the main characters. And maybe one day during one of these episodes, I can bring out those books because I know I still have them. I have like this large, kind of like luggage. Not really a luggage. It's just a large, backpack filled with over 150 different of those books. I started getting a little bit more ambitious with them. They started being, 7 or 8 pages long, but I still was fairly committed to having the stories as minimalistic as possible. And at the time, I didn't know Spanish, so when we moved back here to Mexico, like in around 2011 or 2012 and whatnot, it was kind of interesting and actually really rewarding for my family to, start learning the Spanish, Mexican, language, well, not Mexican language, that sounds really stupid, Mexican Spanish is a thing. There's, generic Spanish that they teach you in American schools. You got Mexican Spanish, you got Spain Spanish, so on and so forth. And my mom, I remember her, breaking down into tears when I showed her Max el Perro, the Spanish dubbed version of my first ever Max the Dog book. And she was like, oh my God, he finally learned Spanish. And it was a big deal. However, even more of a big deal came in the form of Apple. Not the fruit, the major corporation. I became influenced by YouTube at the time. I've been with YouTube since 2006 or 7 when my dad got us a computer, around 2006 or 7. And I was exposed to, the incredibly early age of the internet in terms of, I wasn't on the internet constantly. I didn't, browse any websites, of course, because, to me, it was all about, Nick.com or the Flash games. There were really, really cool Nickelodeon Flash games at the time. And I would just search them by category, of the SpongeBob video games. Well, not video games. The SpongeBob web games, those would be cool. But 99% of my time, it was just watching a ton of cartoon and movie clips on YouTube. And I remember, at the time, you had to watch. If you were there, you were there. And if you know, you know. Fred, Jenna Marble, Shane Dawson, Bo Burnham, Smosh back in the day. And when I came to Mexico in around 2011, I was exposed to this other area of YouTube, which was animation. And I became fascinated with the animation process. So much so that I asked, as a present from my dad, the, at the time, pinnacle of technological achievements, an iPad 2. Once I got my grubby little mitts on it, I started experimenting with animation. There was this really cool application called Animation for Kids HD, because as we all know, certain applications, there were different variations of applications specifically designed for what devices you wanted to download them to. You had Angry Birds for your smartphones, and if you were looking to purchase the same game on a tablet, there would be an alternate variation of the same game called Angry Birds HD, Angry Birds Space HD, and so on and so forth. And I had Animation for Kids HD. But then, at the time, I started getting much more in tune with my creative side again, elevating it far beyond pages of, crappy little 5-page storybooks that I would make for myself and my family. And clay became the big thing in my household. I would go to Office Depots all by myself, or maybe with my parents if I insisted enough that, hey, Mom, please take me home, blah, blah, blah. And I remember buying, there was these, not always in Office Depot, but here in Mexico, we have, smaller, convenience stores that are run by, normal people, and they specialize in, fruits, veggies, kind of pretty much like a convenience store, but there's also an equivalent, in terms of paper stationaries and crafting stuff. And I would love to go to them because I loved crafting ever since I was incredibly young. I loved scissors, crayons, papers, doing stuff with my hands was the thing. Crafting. And there was this insanely obsessive fixation that I had at the time with Play-Doh and clay. I started sculpting. I started creating like little vignettes of characters from my actual Max the Dog books. I created this insanely, it must have been like this small, this large. It was Max, the character Max, just like in a stilted, profile view from him. And I would create his other cast of characters from the actual books that I would write. And given the iPad 2, and also some clay figurines, it wasn't hand-drawn. I started, messing around with a couple of stop-motion animation programs that the iPad 2 had at the time. I can't remember a single one of them because I was a bit of a cheapskate. I refused to, pay for actual apps. I was like, well, my dad already bought this incredibly technologically advanced thing. Why should I be able to pay for why should I pay for more features, At the time, it made sense. In my little brain, it made sense. But I started experimenting with stop motion animation at the time. And if I may brag a little bit, I started watching much more stop motion animation at the time for inspiration, and also looking up more about the creative process of what it really takes to perfect it. And in around 12 or 13, I was severely limited in my material in terms of resources to be able to create something competent. But even to this day, I look back retroactively and I think to myself, that was like my first toe in the gigantic swimming pool that is filmmaking. That was like the first fixation that I had was stop motion animation. Because I remember understanding, squash and stretch physics. I remember understanding the value and knowing when or how to play with, frames. How many frames to have in stop motion to keep it fluid, to keep it crunchy, to keep it more lively and vivid. It started to click more. And I was like, you know what? This is actually pretty cool. I'm liking this. And it escalated with me opening up my very first YouTube channel when I was just 12 years old called Max the Show. And Max the Show ran from what I can remember like around 3.5 years. I know the channel is still up, but I remember just being in a really, really dark place back in 2016 where I can't remember why, but I started deleting a lot of those videos. I'm not really sure because I was I was an incredibly nervous kid at the time. I used a lot of copyrighted music in those videos. And there were a lot of instances. This is so really stupid. Okay. So at that age, I started watching a lot more animation, much more than stop motion. I started watching animation in general, started appreciating it. And you, as like a young lad who, has a fixation with animation, as we all do, us animaniacs, you have, your go-tos, the people that the brands, the franchises that you start fixating on initially. Pixar was a huge, huge, huge one for me. Then DreamWorks. I'm going to be honest, I never really grew up with Disney animated films. I grew up with a very finite select few. The big one for me at the time was Peter Pan when I was like 6 or 7. That movie was one of the movies of my childhood. And I remember just watching a lot of animation. And okay. So in Max the Show, the YouTube channel, it was a stop motion animated, serialized show because it did have somewhat of a continuity within the episodes, Max had a daughter, had multiple kids actually. He remarried. He had all various different characters. Sometimes I would even adapt some of my crummy little stories from my, cartoon days when I was writing them on, 5-inch, pieces of paper. I'm stuttering, my apologies. And I remember out of the blue, I just really wanted those videos to be noticed much more. I wanted more people to watch them. And I started having like pretty outlandish plots just so I could justify the inclusion of a brand new character for that very same episode and have them voiced by a famous celebrity. I don't remember the story. I don't remember the title of the episode. I don't even remember if the episode even exists on YouTube anymore, but I remember watching a lot of Chicken Run at the time. There was like a solid 6 to 3 days where I consider that movie to be my favorite animated movie of all time. And I remember I didn't have a microphone. I only had my iPad. And I remember just making the animation frame by frame with these various characters, adapting whatever material I had planned or I'd improvised. Because the videos were only like 2.5 minutes short. They were really not that. It wasn't Leica that we're talking about. It wasn't Leica. It wasn't even Armin. It was just me. But I would reenact certain scenes from, my comics, where I would just make them up on the spot. And I would write dialogue around specific slices of dialogue that I would grab from movies. There were a lot of sequences where Mel Gibson's Rocky Rhodes from Chicken Run, Rocky the Rhode Island Hen, Rhodes for short, I think that's what his name was, where he would say very specific dialogue and there would be zero, ambiance. There wouldn't be any score accompanying the dialogue. So I could snip his dialogue and copy and paste it into my own episodes. So I could have the episode titled Max the Show, Summer Vacation featuring Mel Gibson. And by God, it worked. We went from around 7 to like maybe 8 views to having over 400. And at the time I can't even go to the convenience store. I got to buy myself some shades. It was huge. It was like 400 views for lying. And I kept on doing it. I remember, my God, I think I became so desperate with that mentality that I would even include popular songs at the time. So I could just include, Selena Gomez, Justin Bieber in the thumbnail. I remember I started getting a little bit better with editing where I was able to download videos from YouTube and I could copy paste them into the editing timeline of my stop motion episodes. So what I would do is I would take the music video from Beauty and the Beat from Justin Bieber and Nicki Minaj and I would just take a screenshot of a little snippet of the background and just take a picture of the Max clay figurine, copy and paste it. It wasn't even Photoshop, man. It was like Photo Editor for Kids, HD 2.0, update, whatever. And I would copy and paste this really crappy, crummy PNG of a stupid, smudged up 4-year-old piece of unidentified clay. You would have no idea it was supposed to be a dog. And I would just copy and paste it in front of the background of the video that I was talking about, the Beauty and the Beat. And then I would just copy and paste those segments of Max just talking with like some crummy voiceover. So I could be like, oh man, Max, the show, Beauty and the Beat, featuring Justin Bieber and Nicki Minaj. It wasn't their music video anymore. It was mine. It was Max's. It was just it was ridiculous. That's what it was. And that was in like around 2013. And around 2016, I stopped. I created different YouTube channels and started actually making more personalized, quality-centered videos. I started making 2D animated episodes of not Max the Show. I rebooted the franchise, basically. There's a video currently on YouTube called Max, which is the 2D animated short that I made like when I was like 14 or 15. It is terrible. It's awful. But it's still around. And I made a couple of sequels and, an entire franchise and an entire channel spun out of that. But that's a story for another day. Speaking of the iPad 2, folks, 2012. That was a year. Your faithful servant, your faithful host of Robert's Roulette, got his hands on an iPad 2. It wasn't all about playing around with stop motion editing programs or animation for kids HD. Let's be honest, 90% of that time was devoted to playing App Store downloaded video games, mobile games to be exact. And oh boy, that is an ecosystem that I would give my left nut to be able to live in again. The innocence, the ignorance, the sheer beauty of being a kid in the early 2010s with an iPad is something that Gen Z would kill to have a fleeting moment to experience. What do I mean by that? If you know, you know. But for those who haven't been honored with that honor, I'll explain. So there were trends. There were pop culture defining moments hinging on releases of certain mobile apps at the time. It was a different marketplace. It was the time that we thought smartphones could do anything and were fascinated by the most minimalistic, incredibly stupid gimmicks that our phones and our tablets and our sometimes even laptops could do. I remember this was just, I have vivid memories, man, of family functions, family reunions, even just, talking with my immediate family in the living room when everybody was on their couch watching TV. There was these stupid one-time gimmick apps that were incredible. I don't know why. I mean, I know why, given the time period and because, at the time we thought, our smartphones, it was, at the time, Siri was considered like this groundbreaking, like, oh my God, Harlan Ellison was right. Technology is finally advanced and peaked, blah, blah, blah. We thought Siri was like the biggest, accomplishment that mankind would have created. And I remember just showing my aunts, my uncles, these stupid effing apps on my phone. It was like a beer app. I don't know how to explain it. It was just this really crummy PNG of like a glass pitcher of beer. And the only function that stupid app had is that due to the, motion detecting, I'm not a technology expert. I don't know what that thing is called. But you would tilt your phone and a sound effect would emit from the speakers indicating that, oh, look, you're tipping away the beer. The beer is spilling out. And then the PNG of the beer would just slowly flatten. And then when you tilted it back to normal rotation, it would fill up again. The gimmick being that you can simulate that you're drinking beer with your phone. There was also, a lighter. It was just a lighter. You would just click it and a little flashy spark would come by and then a small flame would start emitting from this, once again, creamy. I don't even think it was like 3D. It was like a stupid cartoon 2D PNG of a lighter. And you could pretend like, oh, look, hey, Aunt, do you want me to light your cigarette? And I would just bust out that app. And I was the hit of the party. But that wasn't what 2010's mobile app nostalgia was built on. We're talking about the classics. I'm going to talk about Doodle Jump. Now, what was Doodle Jump, you might ask? If you know, you know. But if you don't, I'll be here to tell you. Doodle Jump was basically this incredibly simple game that basically kneeled before the requirements of what it took to be popular in the App Store at the time. Simple, addictive, but not hard enough to a point that it would alienate the casual consumer. Doodle Jump was just basically this alien dude with like a noodle for like a mouth. And you would tilt your phone for him to jump from platform to platform. There wasn't any controls on the actual screen. There wasn't, a D-pad and whatnot. There wasn't a pause button. Well, there was actually a pause button. That's a lie. But you would just tilt your phone, and then the technology of the phone would register the movement and then have the little dude moving from left to right. And you would have to make it so that he needed to hop on different platforms so you could get to the top. There wasn't a definitive end to Doodle Jump. It was basically an endurance test. See how long you can go. See how far you can get up this podium. And then the more you got up, the better chances you had of getting your hands on some power-ups, like a little spring or like a costume. Or the best power-up that Doodle Jump had, it had a rocket launcher that would propel you like 1,000,000 kilometers up top and then land you back onto a platform so you could continue. Additionally to that, you had Fruit Ninja. Fruit Ninja you've definitely heard about because it took off 3 times more than Doodle Jump did. Fruit Ninja, to this day, is one of, I would say it seems to have been much more timeless and has stood the test of time, considering the different variations and adaptations and even ports that it's had on different consoles. Fruit Ninja was basically this really simple swiping application that would register, touchscreen technology with your finger, and you would just slice fruit that would be hurled to the screen, and you would just have to avoid the bombs. Don't slash the bombs, slash the fruits. And there were different variations. I remember there was the original mode of Fruit Ninja. You did have different lives that were in stake, where if you left some of the fruit uncut while it hurtled back down to the ground, one of your lives would deteriorate, and you would have 3 lives per level. And if you hit one of the bombs, you would just game over. You would lose that round. But I remember there being a Zen mode where there wasn't any bombs, but there was a time limit for it. It was 2 minutes of just slicing fruit and just seeing how many points you had. Additionally, there was also, what was the Endless. And as the name would suggest, the Endless mode was pretty much endless. The only way to have that game ended or ruined is to see if you hit a bomb. I can't remember if the game also had a definitive ending or if you were disqualified if you left enough fruits uncut. I don't really remember the specifics of it. But Fruit Ninja was so big at the time that it allowed it to be ported onto major consoles, such as the Xbox 360 for Kinect. I think Doodle Jump also had a variation on Kinect. Instead of just tilting your phone, you would just have to tilt your body from left and right. It was stupid. But Fruit Ninja actually translated fairly well for Kinect. Instead of swiping your fingers, you had to swipe your arms left and right. And it allowed for local multiplayer. And it wouldn't be that complicated. You would just ask somebody to jump in because, the way Kinect worked, it was a computer that you would hook up to your Xbox 360 atop your TV, and it would register your physical, bodily, corporal, movement because it was an IR camera at the end of the day. So you could, I think the limit was 2. I don't remember. Well, there wasn't really even a limit because the Kinect would just register your entire body and just create a silhouette in front of the screen to indicate that was you so that you can know what you were hitting. So it was slice, 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 slice. But the Kinect would just read your movement as if you're slicing, there's going to be the blade popping up on screen. Therefore, you can cut the fruit. So you can just have 4 different people on screen, and all of them can just be hauling ass with their arms. Damn it, sorry. This is Miles Morales from Spider-Verse. We must dignify him. He cannot be knocked over. Hold on. It would be so much fun breaking out that game during family functions because it was incredibly simple. Anybody could enjoy it. Additionally, you got Angry Birds. 2 movies. Endless animated shorts. A collaboration with a major Blue Sky Animated Studios movie from 2011. Rio. Just imagine how successful a franchise has to be that a major animation studio offers to collaborate in creating a brand new mobile game from scratch just to have your name on it. there was a variation of Angry Birds called Angry Birds Rio. Exact same premise. Instead of killing pigs, you had to basically kill whatever canonical villain or threat the Rio movie posed. The first couple of levels were you freeing some of the birds. So instead of like little pigs that you had to kill with the birds with special, powers linked to each and every single one of them, you would have to knock over the obstacles so you could destroy these metal cages, and then the birds could fly away. After the couple of levels, I remembered the main villains from Rio, the first Rio at least, were the dancing monkeys. I don't really remember if they had a specific name. I don't even remember the name of any of them, to be honest. But they were the equivalent of the pigs. They weren't pigs, they were monkeys. And I believe certain characters were also playable as throwable, slingable objects off of the iconic Angry Birds slingshot mechanism. So it wasn't just, red, yellow, blue, and bomb, and the mighty eagle, if you know what I mean. If you know, you know. You could also sling across the slingshots to one of the obstacles, Blue and Jewel. I think Blue and Jewel were playable as well. That's just insane to me. And also, unfortunately, Angry Birds Rio is off of the App Store now, and the only real way to play it is if you have a copy of Angry Birds Trilogy on a console. It's the one game in existence that still manages to keep the Angry Birds Rio dream alive, as Scott Wozniak once said. It was insane. At the time, it was like a match made in heaven. It was 2011. The Rio movie was coming out. It was a bright, colorful movie with birds. And then you contrast it with the internet, where we were losing our minds over bright, colorful birds games. Then you got other variations like Angry Birds Star Wars, Angry Birds Star Wars 2, Angry Birds Space, Angry Birds Seasons, which is basically like the original Angry Birds, but you have like different environments and obstacles themed after different seasons, winter, autumn, summer. And unlike the original Angry Birds game on mobile, this one actually had much more consistent updates. I remember counting down to the day when a specific, season would be unlocked, because I thought it was so cool that it was like, oh my God, there's going to be a new season unlocked, August 31st, it's going to be summer. And, you would have the Angry Birds characters. They would always have cutscenes, like really crummy, rudimentary PNGs of all the characters with like crappy little, sunglasses or, beach hats or beach balls next to the beach. And you would have the pigs stealing their eggs. And it was like, oh, look, it's the same thing, but it's summer, it's winter, it's Christmas, and blah, blah, blah. It was insane. I can't really remember any franchise that really reached the heights of popularity. Franchise expansion, spin-offs. You had Angry Birds Go. There was a Mario Kart clone on mobile that was basically Mario Kart, but it was the Angry Birds cast of characters in their own little go-karts. It was a 3D game, man. I think it was even free at the time. You had Angry Birds Epic, which was not a social RPG. It was a normal RPG. I think it was, I'm not that really into video games in general, so I don't know the entire terminology of what what Angry Birds Epic would be technically classified under the wide umbrella of RPG games. I do understand that there are variants. I don't know what that game was, but I know it was an RPG. You had Angry Birds Pop. You had the Angry Birds movies, of course. Endless Angry Birds merchandise, and so on and so forth. But nothing compares to what I was playing in the dark Saturday nights with my cousins. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, I love movies, I love cartoons, and I love shows. I've never been a video game guy. I have nothing against it. It's just a hobby, an artistic taste that I was never that introduced to or was pushed, socially or even in my household to really engage with. Furthermore, video games I've played Mario, of course, as everybody does, but it was never a thing for me because my thing was always, more, cinematic, more Other visual mediums, if you know what I mean. My only real first severe, serious fixation with video games was through mobile apps. That was like, considering my relationship with my iPad that I had at the time, which I was locked into that iPad 24/7. I had to play the games. It was the thing to do. What else was I going to do? Go on 4chan at the age of 17? 17. Just kidding, I was 13. But dude, sure, it's a mobile app. I think it was free, actually. But I played some of them. I've gone through The Last of Us 1. I've gone through The Last of Us 2. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. I love Mario platformers. I loved Angry Birds Trilogy on Wii. I do like video games. It's not really a hobby that I really have any interest in developing or to really expand my taste in, which of course that opinion might change in the future. Nothing will ever top my incredibly subjective experience that I witnessed when I was around 12 or 11 with Dark Echo. Dark Echo was, in hindsight, a minimalistic survival horror game on the App Store. I believe you can still download it, although I don't really know if it's free anymore. And I fell in love with the gameplay and the aesthetic and the sheer setup of the game. It was just a black screen, and you would slowly have to meander and walk across this completely darkened room. And the only way for you to maneuver yourself would be through sound or noises. And the sounds, noises, would be emanating from your footsteps. Maybe you could hear water droplets across the room to indicate that maybe there's the exit over there. But it was all black. The sounds would be visually represented with little wave lines. You would slowly walk. You would just repeatedly have to tap on the screen, and then you would slowly, pitter-patter your way, left, right, up and down to try and find a way out. And if you made enough sound, you could hold onto the screen, and once you released, it would clap. And the gigantic wave of white circles or, wavelengths, I don't even remember what they were. And they would bounce across the entire screen, showing you the visual representation of the actual room you're in. The more noise you make, the more you get to know what's your surroundings. Daredevil style, basically. Basically, kind of like echolocation. You can see if you hear. The problem is, normal sounds would be white. Red sounds represented danger. You made a lot of noise. The noise would bounce across the room. And if it hit him, you would see these little red footsteps coming towards you. You would either waddle over to the corner and hope to God the white little sound waves don't hit this guy, indicating where you are. Because if you did, he would catch you. And the screen would burst into a heap of red sound waves, concluding with a violent scream, indicating your demise. Replay. That replay button was clicked so many times at 1 a.m. with my cousins when we blasted that game at full blast with our headphones. It was incredibly simple, but the setup to me was so incredibly interesting. It pretty much plays around with a lot of, it's a very creative game. The premise is really original. And it really resonated for me. It might have been the filmmaker side of me where I was like appreciating, the nuances of it playing with, sound and, representing sound into a visual medium, and also the interactivity of it being a mobile game and whatnot. That probably had a factor in it, but I kind of want to download that game again, but I also know that I'm probably going to be disappointed because, the pink glasses are already over there. And I kind of like, keeping to that impression or that whimsy of, I kind of like just having that memory as a memory in that particular period of time with that game. And I don't really want to alter it with the reality of what maybe that game is now. Maybe the game is different. Maybe the game isn't as good as I thought it was. Maybe it's boring. Who knows? But that was the game to play in my household at the time. Do you remember? Okay. Talking Tom. Once again, the one-time gimmick apps, the more simpler, the more better. The simpler, the better. Talking Ben, Talking Angela, which, by the way, at the time, so anyway, what am I talking about? So Talking Tom was basically this 3D model of a cat that would link up to your microphone on your smartphone for you to say dialogue in front of it, say speeches like hello, and then he would repeat it into a chipmunk voice, hello. And all the uncles and aunts at the time went crazy for Talking Tom. It developed spin-offs in its own little franchise. Talking Ben, it was a dog. Talking Angela, the canonical girlfriend of Tom, it was a cat. And I remember, this is probably going to be a subject later in the video. I'll bring this up briefly, but I remember just, there was this whole different subgenre on YouTube of just people screen recording, all the random BS that they would have Talking Tom say. Dude, it would get like hundreds of thousands of views. The internet was incredibly different at the time. And I remember there was like a crossover app. It was a news broadcast game, but I think it could allow you to upload videos and pictures of your iPhone or iPad camera roll or photo gallery, and the game would simulate a parody of a news broadcast with the two anchors being, Talking Tom and Talking Ben. And still the gimmick. You would say dialogue, and they would repeat it in a chipmunk voice, or in Ben's case, he would repeat it in a deeper voice, a deeper AI voice, like hello there, blah, blah, blah. Hello there. Hello there. Hello there. Hello there. And you would basically, have little interactions with one of them, and you would make your own little playful, jokey news broadcast of whatever news you felt like the world had to know today. I think it was called the Talking Ben and Talking Tom. I don't even want to know what it was. I also remember there were these animated shorts on YouTube of the Talking Tom characters, but it was like their own little cartoon. I think it was Talking Friends. They might have a different iteration of it currently, because when I Googled it a few years ago, they're still making them, but it's not the same animated shorts that I'm talking about. The ones that I'm talking about, they were called Talking Friends too, but the animation was a lot crappier. And the stories were just, it was the same models that they had in the games. But the new Talking Friends animated show has like cutesier models, if that makes any sense. It was a whole thing, man. It's insane how much large corporations tended to see the most simplest, asininely substanceless apps in the entire App Store as potential multi-million-dollar franchises. Why does a Doodle Jump t-shirt exist in Hot Topic? You know what I mean? It's a little weird if you really think, because it was at a time when people would just download near anything if it was free. It's kind of funny, how demanding in contrast gamers or even mobile users can be nowadays, because that market isn't really around anymore. People don't really it might be the echo chamber talking, of course, but I don't really see people playing that much games on phones anymore. Now we're just, being stimulated by the oh so beautiful algorithm and just feeding us all type of other garbage in our brains. But that did sound pretentious, I know, but I wanted it to sound pretentious because it is kind of weird. I mean, it is fake deep. I'm probably trying to make something out of this that's probably not there. I know. It's just kind of an interesting observation that I wanted to share. Anyways, next up, we're going to talk about, let's take a look here. All right, video editors. Yeah. I made these notes on the bus, basically, when I was on my way to work. Let's see, Max the Show, we already talked about that. Over 12 years on YouTube, I already talked about that. Perseverance. Let me take. Oh, that's a good subject matter. Maybe I'll talk about that later. Oh, right. I have to talk about this. Speaking about things being different, dude, I have to remind myself how asininely stupid we could be as a society on the internet and around the early 2010s. We were a different breed. And one of my primary examples was making up a thing around a thing when it isn't a thing. Talking Angela, a spin-off of the Talking Tom mobile app craze. It was just a normal, regular 3D model of an animal, and the application would link up to the microphone on your smartphone or application for you to speak to it, and it'll repeat what you said in an altered tone, in a filtered voice like a chipmunk, a deeper voice, or in Angela's case, in a sensual female voice. That was like kind of its little shtick. Her being canonically Talking Tom's girlfriend. They wanted to, romanticize her or, give her the whole, female iteration criteria procedure that you had to have in the early 2010s. So it was like, oh, Talking Tom. He was a dude. So he was, his background was just a brick wall. And he was like, it seemed like Talking Tom was always, talking to you and you were talking to him while he was like in an alleyway. And in contrast, his beautiful, lovely female cat girlfriend, she was like drinking coffee in a French cafe. That was the setup. And on top of that, I was an idiot too at the time. And I fell for it. What? Let me explain. The internet never seemed to stop hyperfixating on meaningless details for every little thing. There was this incredibly stupid conspiracy theory. Kind of reminds me of SimSimi when that was a thing a few years ago. Talking Angela was actually a gateway for the FBI or for other corrupt officials to have access to your personal life, mining your information, keeping an eye on you. And how were they going to do that, you might ask? A white pussy. No, I'm just kidding. People started screenshotting images of Talking Angela and zooming into her pupils. The theory goes that on very rare occasions, when you would be talking to Talking Angela, you could see inside of her pupil the image of a man staring at you, listening to you, recording everything you say to it. There were countless videos made at the time talking about that, talking about how the Talking Angela app was a danger to society and to kids because it was marketed as like a fun, entertainment thing to keep your kids preoccupied while you were at the Cheesecake Factory. You know what I mean? It was like the precursor to Coco Melon. But it was a little interactive, you know what I mean? The kids could say whatever they wanted to that cat, and the cat would respond it, and it was like, ooh, she said it in a different voice than me. But at the same time, Big Brother was always watching you. He always kept an eye on you through that damn cat. It was an incredibly stupid theory that for some reason got a shoot ton of legs. It was like, there were so many people, even down here in Mexico, that was like a thing where they were like, dude, don't, Christian Mexican moms would be like, you better effing delete that app or else the devil's going to come get you. It was like a thing. And it's like, it has no validity, man, because people have ripped through the files of that game ever since. And they're like, no, it's like, and the application, and there were like actual photographic evidence of like the silhouette. Even by that standards, why, if they're going to spy you on the, why if the government would really want to spy on you, why would they provide an in real time, by the way, video footage view? Well, feed video feed of them stalking you. Why would they keep it there? It was insane. It's actually really funny in retrospect how much, I mean, it was 2015 or 2014 at the time. People were much more gullible at the time. I think it's really funny. Now, when I was 14 and I started reading about that, it really freaked me out. I thought it was real. I was an incredibly gullible kid at the time. So much so that, if I'm being honest with you, I've seen like retro memes or memes on the internet that are like calling back to like old internet pop culture from like the early 2010s or early 2000s. And there was this idiot who, made a meme making fun about like, hey, remember when people thought that the government was spying on us through Talking Angela? And it had, attached to it, an actual, screenshot of the Talking Angela app. And I still remember the stare that she had. Because all the Talking Friends apps at the time was just a 3D model staring at the screen, like directly at the camera. I remember with Talking Tom, Talking Ben. But the Talking Angela static stare at the screen, I'd be lying to you if it still doesn't, carry a little weight to me. Because it brings me back. Because I was like, dude, I'm being watched. Or maybe I'm just really stupid. Folks, the time has come. Our first ever Robert's review on Robert's Roulette. What are we going to talk about, guys? Fairly simple, really. The MCU. Oh, boy. Where to begin? So, as many have jokingly and unoriginally have declared, this is in fact our fourth attempt at a Fantastic Four, Marvel's First Family, on the silver screen. And how did it go? Honestly, okay, let me give you a little bit of background. I'm an MCU fan, but her and I have been very sketchy lately. It's been ups and downs. I love Daredevil, the original Netflix Daredevil TV show. The Daredevil Born Again show severely disappointed me. Maybe some other time we'll dedicate an entire video to that. But for now, I'll just leave it at, I didn't like it at all. I thought Thunderbolts was pretty good. There are moments of Brave New World that I think are actually really cool. I really liked Sam Wilson's Captain America, and I thought they gave him really good action sequences. But I mean, I've stopped watching a lot of the Marvel TV shows, if I'm being honest, because with Marvel television, I'm done. I loved Kamala Khan, but I couldn't finish her show. I didn't watch Agatha. I'm not going to watch Ironheart because, no amount of money ever bought a second of time. But here comes F4, FS. And what do I think of it? I'll say this. I have been so genuinely disillusioned with the MCU lately, and specifically with Daredevil Born Again, a show that I legitimately found it to be painful to watch, especially because they're just plucking a character that I have an immense amount of love for, Charlie Cox's iteration of Matt Murdock, plucking him out of Netflix canon and then slopping him into the MCU. And then they do that to him in the show. They turn him into a buffoon, an immature, whiny brat, an unlikable flanderization of what Matt Murdock is. I thought was indefensible. I was watching it with a friend. And if it wasn't for my friend coaching me from my sheer fury that was enduring that show, I may have been done with the MCU, if I'm being honest. The last couple MCU projects have not piqued my interest slightly or even remotely. I haven't watched all the shows. I haven't watched any of the movies. And I'm going to be honest with you, the Fantastic Four marketing didn't seem all that interesting to me. And I'll explain why in a moment. It was an interesting marketing campaign because we were also on the heels of some really, in contrast, some really explosive, energized marketing that was James Gunn's Superman movie, where every single trailer, every single fleeting moment, people, the fan base, the James Gunn stans, the people who were merely curious about that project were salivating at the bit to get any semblance of new footage, new visuals, new information related to that project. And I didn't really see that with Fantastic Four First Steps. Because in my opinion, those trailers, the way they're edited, they're expecting that you're already excited for the characters, because those trailers rarely showed the team dynamic, the characterization of each one of their members, to show you how different this reboot is to the prior reboots. The closest we may have gotten was, that, okay, with Eban's iteration of the Thing. That was like the closest semblance that we got of like, you know what? They're giving me a taste of what this character is. I'm getting something out of this movie, if anything at all. And of course, you had the visuals of the movie displayed in the trailers. You had a lot of scenes that basically ended up being cut in the film. But anyways, the trailer was playing and was edited to create a sense of wonder and awe for people who were already programmed to love this movie even before it came out. What am I talking about? I'm talking about, the MCU fans that'll love anything unconditionally that they make. That was a trailer that was made for people expecting to already be excited for the film just because it was the MCU's, the Marvel Studio iteration of the Fantastic Four. There was a lot riding on F4 from a business perspective, from the fan perspective, many things. Marvel has not been doing all that great lately. People were like, can Marvel finally give us a decent Fantastic Four movie? And not only did, in this critic's opinion, but they delivered what in my eyes is top 10 Marvel Studios pictures. I was incredibly pleased with the Fantastic Four First Steps. I thought it was an incredibly fun movie, extremely entertaining, not perfect, but just what the MCU needs right now. Let me get into it. First off, Matt Shakman, the director of the film. I would like to apologize to him because I was kind of a naysayer. I was a little opposed or a little repelled by the idea because I'm of the few who really doesn't enjoy WandaVision all that much. I think it's incredibly overrated, at least in my opinion. There are a lot of things that maybe you think are overrated that I love. It's okay. That's the subjectivity of art. I'm not the biggest fan of WandaVision, and I was incredibly concerned personally that a major director from the WandaVision TV show was going to helm the Fantastic Four. Because I was like, dude, is this guy already so one note that he can't help himself but have to hinge an entire project on an old-timey 60s aesthetic, much like what WandaVision was in its first few episodes? Now he's implementing it again in the Fantastic Four, but just applying it to an entire city because it's going to be a different universe because of the multiverse shenanigans and whatnot. I was like, but it actually ended up winning me over after the first few minutes. The aesthetic of that world and the sheer scale of how much the movie is actually allowing you to see is pretty interesting. Interesting in the fact that the world and the city kind of plays a part in the story in the midpoint. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. It has to do with Sue Storm and her baby. It was in the trailer. In the trailer, they show Franklin being born already, so it's not really a spoiler. I was actually pretty impressed of how much world building they were able to squeeze out of. I mean, it's not the focus of the film. It's not like the world's greatest world building, but there's enough it does manage to make a pretty strong impression to a point when that exact same world is jeopardized by this, impending threat. You actually kind of care for the people. I'm reminded of those scenes in Lord of the Rings where you would have this gigantic battle happening and then it would just cut to the civilians just curdling in the corner of a room, just, tears in their eyes, just freaking out over the situation. It's giving you the impression of the humanity that's at stake. And that's something that, I'm going to be honest, I didn't even feel during Infinity War or Endgame. But I felt it with Fantastic Four, so I was like, you know what? I kind of want to see the Fantastic Four defeat this threat for the sake of this world, because you're giving me reasons to actually care for them, at least enough. It's not, I'm not talking it's like, Spider-Verse levels of world building where they're actually, point by point, bit by bit explaining and giving you emotional pathos to every single conceivable detail. It's good enough to where it manages to leave a lasting impression, which I really appreciated. I thought Matt Shakman directed the out of the movie. For a comic book movie, for what it is, of course. It's not, it's not Denis Villeneuve, it's not Nolan. But for Marvel Studios, F4 First Steps is honestly one of the best directed films in the entire saga, including the TV shows. There are a lot of beautiful shots in this film. Beautiful shots. There's a shot that I believe was revealed in one of the trailers. It has to do with Silver Surfer and Johnny Storm, contrasted with the sun when they're up in the upper atmosphere, that I thought was beautiful. Galactus' sequences were shot incredibly intimidatingly to show you the scale and size of this being. It's pretty impressive. I was incredibly impressed with how much I was noticing details like this during Fantastic Four. I was like, damn, this Matt Shakman, unlike 99% of other MCU directors, save for, Gunn, Coogler, or the Russo brothers, I'd throw in Destin Daniel Cretton in there too. Matt Shakman, man, he seemed to have like a legit passion for this project, which I thought was incredibly refreshing for the MCU recently. Because even Thunderbolts, a film that I really enjoyed, this seemed to have been like on another level. Every set piece is incredibly well constructed to really show off the scale and grandness of every concept that they were able to dream up. Galactus' ship, the actual planet where the Fantastic Four originate, the action sequences, the way the camera swishes around and shows you and knows when to cut, it's it's very pleasing to watch, actually. It harkens back to old school Marvel. And I mean that, of course, in the best way possible. A lot of people were talking about, like, hey, this feels like classic peak MCU. And honestly, I have to agree. Because the Fantastic Four First Steps movie actually lets you give a fucking damn over the characters. The Fantastic Four themselves are great in this movie. You feel their dynamic together. You feel their love and bond with one another. You have sequences, moments, character scenes, dialogue scenes within each one of the conceivable switch-ups or matchups that you can think of. You have a couple of scenes of Johnny and Reed. You have Reed with the Thing. You got scenes with Ben and Storm, and then Storm with Johnny, and they're always very meticulously made to really showcase the individual relationships within each and every single one of them as a group, but also as, as brother and sister, as husband and wife, as best friend and best friend. Vanessa Kirby's Sue Storm. I loved her. I thought she was great. Performance-wise and character-wise, this is what I want Marvel to do with their characters. Elevating them. Showing you different facets of them. I don't think it's that controversial to say that Sue Storm has never been that much of... She's never been, people's most popular or favorite character to pick off of the original Fantastic Four lineup. My God, she's my favorite character in this movie. She gets stuff done. She has stake in the plot. She actually, if stuff ain't working out, Sue Storm is probably going to figure out a way out of it. Using communication. Using, her motherly instincts when we're talking about her child. She fixes a lot more than Reed, if you really think about it. If you see the movie, you'll understand what I'm trying to say. And it's actually, I thought it was going to have done it. I heard about how they were going to elevate Sue Storm in this film, and I was excited and open about it, but I also wanted there to be a balance. I wanted everybody to have, a specific moment. Everybody has a moment to shine. Everybody. Johnny Storm, pretty much my favorite Johnny Storm that we've had to date in film. Easily. I mean, we don't have that much to go off of, but I think Cosmonaut Variety Hour summed it up best. It's a perfect combination between, horny, heroic, and silly and fun. I love Johnny in this movie. Joseph Quinn, he's a much more restrained Johnny Storm. He's playing it with, a little bit more confidence. Like, he's not smiling all that long. He's not as goofy as, Chris Evans but he also isn't as, completely, devoid of any emotion. Like, sadly, Michael B. Jordan was in his iteration of Johnny Storm in Fantastic. Not to his fault. That was, mostly, the studio, the director, the writer, and the movie around him just wasn't all that good. But Johnny Storm in this movie, I thought was really, really cool. They nailed this character. I'm excited, hopefully, to see this character with Tom Holland. Because, in the comics, Peter Parker and Johnny Storm are like BFFs. Iban, cousin from The Bear. I forget how to pronounce his last name. I thought he was great. Dude, conceptually, the casting to get, Iban from The Bear as Ben Grimm. When I heard that, like, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, whenever they announced the Fantastic Four, I was like, oh my God. That's effing perfect. If you've seen The Bear, he's basically playing like Ben Grimm in that show. He's perfect. I'm also keeping the water bottle away from the laptop because you never know, right? The Thing, Sue Storm, Pedro Pascal. I'm going to be honest, I'm feeling a bit of Pedro Pascal fatigue. I've already seen him in Eddington. Every week on The Last of Us. I loved Materialist. I loved him in that. I thought he was a good Mandalorian. I was like, Pedro Pascal as Reed Richards, how is that going to work? And I have to say, I ended up really, really liking him. I thought he ended up working out pretty well. I like sequences with dialogue that really, there are specific dialogue moments with each and every single one of those members that really just hit to the bone marrow of what those characters are all about. And I thought that was incredibly satisfying to watch because for once their dialogue actually matches their actions. They feel like the Fantastic Four. Each member feels like how you would expect them to feel, even though they are, changing a little bit from the original source material because they're giving a little bit more importance to certain other characters and giving more stake and more, I'll just say, more autonomy to certain characters that haven't had that much autonomy in stories in other Fantastic Four, projects, which I thought was really, really refreshing to watch. Like specifically with Sue Storm, this is pretty much, the best Sue Storm I think we're ever going to get in live action film. I mean, we've only had 4 right now, I'm acting as if it's like James Bond. It's like, oh my God, Sue Storm, and there's like 17. No. But she was great. Dude, who knew we were going to get a character arc for the Silver Surfer? I was really excited to see Shala Ball's debut in a film. I like Shala Ball. I always liked her visually. I haven't read any comic stories with her, but I always thought, the Silver Surfer, aesthetic and character design, I think aesthetically looks cooler when it's like a female body. So I was like, I've known about Shala Ball for like years just because I really like her character design. I just think she looks cooler than, Norman, whatever his name is, Norman Rad. I don't know. I don't really remember what the original Silver Surfer's name was, so apologies for that. But I thought she was so cool, man. Then they actually gave her stuff to do. They gave explanations. They gave her backstory that I didn't really expect. It's fleeting, the amount of, stuff that they add to her mythos and the stuff that they have her to do. It's pretty fleeting. But the character design, the VFX in this movie in general are very, very impressive for a Marvel movie when you compare them to like Quantum Mania. Or even like, dude, there are some buildings in Brave New World that look completely fake and so blurry. This movie looks pretty damn good for a Marvel movie. It's very immersible, if that makes sense. And Galactus, no spoilers, but I'll just say I'm excited to see if we get to see him again. I thought the Fantastic Four First Steps was a very, very good Marvel movie. I loved the Fantastic Four First Steps. And right now, my personal promise that I made to myself, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've been very wishy-washy with the MCU. There's a lot of other projects that I'm not going to watch from the MCU. I'm not going to watch Eyes of Wakanda. I'm not going to watch Wonder Man. I'm not. Marvel TV shows, you watch one, you've pretty much seen them all. They all have the same problems that I can no longer tolerate, personally at least. But in terms of the movies, a lot of the movies I haven't been that fond of either. I don't think they're bad, I just think they're worse. And you know why? Because what's worse than being bad, irritating, horribly constructed, terribly made? Boring. Because like a bad dream, you forget about them. To me, that's worse. And I made a pact with myself. I'm going to give Marvel 2 last chances. I think it's refreshing that Phase 6, the end of the multiverse saga, has the potential to be, from a theatrical standpoint, the best phase that the MCU has ever made because it's so simple, non-complicated, and it just hinges on extremely fan-favorite characters that me personally I've always wanted to see. We only got 2 Avengers movies. We got the debut of Victor Von Doom. Secret Wars is going to be adapted. A Spider-Man movie and a Fantastic Four movie. That's like if Robert became Kevin Feige for a day. It's like, screw you guys. We're just going to have an entire phase of 7 different Daredevil movies with Charlie Cox. We're going to adapt Muse, but right. Anyways, I told myself I'm not going to watch Doomsday or Secret Wars if First Steps and Brand New Day don't impress me. We're 1 out of 2. Fantastic Four, First Steps. Right now with Marvel, I've been pretty hesitant to, like, am I still going to be watching Marvel? Probably not in a few years at the rate that they're at right now. But right now, I'm like, after Fantastic Four, I'm like, okay, Marvel. All right, Marvel. I'm listening. Okay. I'm down. I'm actually a little bit more excited for Spider-Man Brand New Day after Fantastic Four. I like Shang-Chi. I like Destin Daniel Cretton directing. Let's hope that we finally give Tom Holland a Spider-Man movie he deserves. A movie where he's actually Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Topic for another day. However, speaking about the Fantastic Four First Steps, I've noticed this very interesting discourse that has emerged in the internet for the past few days, alongside, a lot of reviews referring to the Fantastic Four's First Steps iteration of the Fantastic Four. That sounded really redundant. I know, I'm so sorry. I'm talking about, is Reed Richards on the spectrum? Okay, here's my thoughts on the matter. So a lot of people are mostly hinging, their suspicions or, the plausible hypothetical scenario that what if Marvel Studios decided to adapt Reed Richards in this movie as kind of being a little autistic or maybe having Asperger's, being somewhere on the beautiful spectrum? And here's my thoughts about it. I pondered that thought to myself after watching the movie, because I saw a couple of reviews alluding to that before I was watching the movie, before I went in and watched it in the movie theater. And originally, coming out of the theater, I didn't really notice it because I was much more fixated on seeing if they were going to get the Reed Richards character down, in essence. And in my opinion, they hit it to the bone fairly well. They don't really play up his mean or rude or imprudence, or how would you call it? I don't really know. Reed Richards, if you know from the comic, Reed Richards isn't the nicest person in the world, because he's so fixated on his craft, his scientific craft. And that left me thinking, well, if Reed Richards were to be on the spectrum in this new movie, what does that add to the story? I'm all down with representation. Why not? But the more I thought about it, the more it conceptually kind of makes a little sense, given how Reed Richards is usually supposed to act, given his source material. Now, I'm not an expert in the comic books. I'm more so a casual comic book fan and a super fan of the movie iterations of comic books. I love comic book movies. I don't read a lot of comic books, to be honest. I have respect for comic books. I love the movies. That's just me. And from what I remember Reed Richards being in the comics, there are various iterations on where or how you can tackle Reed Richards and the entirety of the Fantastic Four, actually. There are different versions of the character. There are silly versions of him. There are more serious versions of him. And the Fantastic Four First Steps from the Marvel Studios movie seems to play him a little bit more restrained, a little more... It's much more of a quieter performance than I expect from Pedro Pascal. Not subtle, but quiet. He's not, as expressive, but he is still emoting. Reed Richards in this film is definitely going through kind of like an emotional duel with letting, at least this is from my perspective, a lot of stuff is happening in this movie where Reed Richards doesn't seem to be totally emotionally there. He understands in practice the problems that are arising in the film. However, he's not emotionally there, which fits the character of Reed Richards perfectly. Reed Richards he's supposed to be what Tony Stark is in Iron Man 3. Like this man that's completely consumed by his own anxiety of an impending doom that he has no say in the matter. That's what Reed Richards is supposed to be. That's why I love Iron Man 3, because Tony Stark is also supposed to be that. He's not supposed to be, a 24/7 joke machine. His character is riddled with a little bit of anxiety and guilt constantly. And Reed Richards is, basically supposed to be kind of like a Tony Stark See, but, much more smarter and also a lot less nicer or quippier. Because Reed Richards, from essence, he doesn't have time for social skills to be developed. He doesn't have time or even the interest to understand your feelings on any matter if he has a solution that he genuinely believes can help you, or for the greater good, or for the greater good of the galaxy, or in this case, the universe. And so from that perspective, if we're going to have to assign that label to him, at least it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of like an interesting iteration or a cool take on Reed Richards. We're going to make him on the spectrum. I'm really open to that idea. I like the idea of, because from a retroactive perspective, Reed Richards kind of does seem to be a little bit on the spectrum, even in the comic books from what I remember, and even in the previous films, there are moments, especially with Miles Teller's iteration of the character, it's kind of like, I can see him, kind of like being a little socially awkward. I can see him being a little bit more stubborn than usual. Additionally, because, as a person who's also on the spectrum, it is incredibly rewarding and super exciting to see a main MCU character being on the spectrum and also accomplishing so much in the film and potentially having a very prominent and bright future in the MCU as well. Pedro Pascal is going to be in Doomsday, so that's really cool. My personal thoughts on the matter is I'd like him to be on the spectrum if they're actually committed to really delving and making a point out of it instead of just... there are two sides to that coin, because in one half, I don't really want it to be that, let's just say, I don't want really Marvel to make that big of a deal of it. If it was intentional, and they do have intentions on, fulfilling or, committing to that characteristic that they decided to add to this iteration of Reed Richards, I would like them to either make a point out of it and not just add it there for tokenism, or reference it to a point where it's like it's a side thing of the character, but still focus on making the character great. So inadvertently, the tokenism, it wouldn't be tokenism anymore. It would just be, hey, this is a really cool character who just so happens to also be on the spectrum. That's much more fulfilling and much more healthier and much more proper representation for our community. That would be so cool. Because it's like, hell yeah, Reed Richards, he has that same mental condition as I am. And look at him. He's out there being a badass. He's out there trying to do his best. He's being a good father. He's being a good husband. He's being a good friend. And also, he happens to be the smartest man in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because in the comics, Reed Richards is supposed to be smart. I think that's really cool. I'm down with it, actually, the more that I think about it. But we are just hinging on that hypothetical scenario because of Pedro's performance being so much more restrained. I feel there's this softness to him and kind of like this antisocial quirk that he decides to elicit, either intentionally or unintentionally. With performances, it is a little bit subjective of what people can get out of it, I personally didn't really see it in my first viewing. I'm just more so, more convinced and more open to it, not opposed to it, given the history of the character and the source material. I think Reed Richards being, autistic, at least to a certain degree, does kind of fit the character and actually does kind of... There's a lot of qualities with, with that level of neurodivergence that does align perfectly with the character from Reed Richards, even from the source material back in even in the Kirby comics, from what I remember. That it's like, this is a really organic evolution to this character that I would kill to see implemented. However, either if they're not going to really dive into it, I would love if they don't really focus on it. It's like kind of like a side thing. I would just like him to be, first off, a good character, and then secondary, being a person who shares the same mental condition as I do. Sorry, I burped. My apologies. I think that's really cool. I think the discourse on Reed Richards possibly being on the spectrum kind of makes me excited, because, I'm not the first person to say it, and nor will I be the last, but we are witnessing a very intense social reckoning on various different political, emotional subjects, especially with, mental health, being much more, it's much more, it's not even cool. It's not even hip. It's not even, frowned upon to talk about. It's just pretty much being, hey man, how are you doing? How are you feeling? People are more accustomed now to actually say that in a genuine way. People are much more conscious and much more open to letting you speak your feelings, talk about interesting things. And autism really hasn't been that well, accepted into that fan club, at least until recently, because, the only representation that we've really had is only through memes and shit posts. So Reed Richards being on the spectrum could open the possibility of, society being open to discuss neurodivergency in film in a way that isn't a complete character like The Big Bang Theory, if you know what I mean. I think that's really cool. It's an interesting choice that's hinging on the subjective interpretation of an actor that I'm honestly not opposed to, because it lines up beautifully with what that character is supposed to be. So in a weird way, it's like a match made in heaven. So I'm down for it. I'm down for Marvel Studios in 2029. Fantastic Four. First Dino Nuggies. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, folks, I believe we're going to leave it at that for today. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Is it rambling? Yes, it is. Was I a little bit nervous today? I was a little bit. I'm not very used to improvising on the spot. I'm pretty terrible talking when I don't have, a script with me to, guide me to bullet points or specific jokes or winks or quips. But I'm hoping to genuinely get better, to improve my dialect in English, to improve my social skills so I can, execute a social conversation in a more organic and natural way. That's also good. I feel fulfilled right now. I'm very excited because, this is a personal passion project of mine that I've been working on for a few months now, and I'm pretty excited to finally say that I've finished the first episode. And feel free to comment. I'm open to criticism. Talk about anything. The world is a large place. The rainbow has many colors. Everybody has an opinion, and I'm open to us exercising dialect in a healthy and constructive manner. I think this is cool. You might think it's not. I have a thesis. You're an antithesis. And when we collide, human knowledge can get better. And we'll get to a synopsis. We'll get better together. That's the beauty of communication. That's the beauty of conversation, at least in my personal opinion. And once again, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next time. This is what I'm talking about, man. My English has gotten so much worse in the past few years because I haven't been speaking it that much. So I'm hoping to get that corrected. I'm hoping to watch more videos, read more, learn more, try to get that, English percentage up to at least an 87% instead of a 62. Anyways, folks, this has been Robert's Roulette, the first ever episode. It has been a pleasure speaking with you tonight. Have a wonderful day. I love you. Feel free to subscribe if you want to watch more. And until then, take care.